For our COBT viewers, it's Maynard, Mike, and Todd here with something really, really fun. We've got Jim Robb. He's the president and CEO of the North American Energy Reliability Council. What's really fun, and Jim, I'll share this with you, when we had John Baer on from MISO, we were talking, and at one point we said, God, there should be somebody who's just really focused on energy reliability. And he said, you gotta talk to Jim Robb. So here we are, we're a few months later. We tracked down Jim, and Jim graciously agreed to join us. Jim's got a long career in the power industry, working in the public sector, the private sector, also worked at McKinsey. Jim, we're just delighted to have you. Thank you for joining us and trying to help us sort out our power questions.
Well, no, I'm glad to be here. The questions are becoming more and more real as we kind of continue this energy transition toward a cleaner grid and a cleaner economy and a more electrified economy. And in that context, electric reliability has never been more important, and it's only going to become more important as more and more end uses of energy become electrified.
This is why we're so excited. There's a lot to do, and there's a lot of growth. I mean, there's so many angles on this thing. Mike, before we get started with Jim, what would you throw in on the markets?
Yeah, Maynard, today markets are a bit mixed. I'd say the big issue today is crude oil. Crude oil is off about $3.50. We're now down to about $77.50 a barrel, and that's really strong technical support there, and so crude really has to hold there. The next support is around $72 to $73 per barrel, and so, like I said, $77.50 is a really, really strong support barrel. So the question is, why are we down roughly $9 since the October 7th incursion into Gaza? I'd say it's a couple things. First of all, it's crude oil time spreads are really weak, which is telling you the market is physically getting weaker. Second of all, we saw today Chinese economic data came in weak, and so people are saying demand looks weak, and that kind of goes into what we just said about the crude oil time spread. So I think what's going on right now is, which is ironic today, OPEC came out and said that they expect demand in 2024 to be up 2 million barrels a day. There's going to be a November 26th OPEC meeting. At that point in time, we're going to find out if the 1.3 million barrels of production cuts are going to be extended through December, which they are right now. Are they going to be extended to next year? If crude stays the way it is, it's probably going to be extended to next year. And so the one thing that we're actually been looking at this week, as it really kind of plays into our guest today, is what's going on in the utility world. In this last week, a big Southern utility called Southern, they came out with projections of what they think electricity demand is going to be over the next 5 years. In the previous decade or so, their electricity demand was up about 0 to 1%. They're talking about the electricity production over the next 5 years is going to be up mid-single digits to high single digits, and that is just gigantic. And the reason why that is because they're talking about, electricity demand from AI and from these data centers and manufacturing. So they're not the only ones out there that they're seeing this. We're also seeing on these Q3 calls that a lot of utilities are looking to raise their growth rates for electricity demand over the next 4 or 5 years. And so I think what that points to is that, the electricity grid is really, really tight right now. Transmission is tight. We're getting close to basically brownout and blackouts. And given this growth that we're seeing over the next 5 years, it's only going to get worse. So what does that mean? That means we're going to need all the renewables we can get. It means we're going to need all the natural gas transmission we're going to need. And I think the interesting thing we're also hearing in this quarter is that some of these coal retirements are being pushed out because we're going to need them given the electricity demand that we're seeing. So that's something. The last thing I'd say is that, in November and 12th through 14th is EEI, which is the Edison Electric Institute. They're going to have their annual meeting in Phoenix this year. And so I think this is going to be really important because it's going to highlight some of the trends that we just talked about. Some of these electricity trends growing. They're going to be talking a lot about transmission, transformer, load-based demand. So we think that if you're going there, great. We're going to hear a lot of information from that. So we're probably going to have a lot to hear, talk to you this week and next week about what happened to EI. So with that, Maynard, we'll go ahead and hand it back to you.
Okay, awesome. Todd, anything for the pregame?
Well, no, I don't have a whole lot of new information other than to say it's been really interesting, as we've been up and running at Veriton, how much time we spend on power in general. And, we all kind of came a little more from oil and gas, and we've found that power has become such a focus, and much more so than we thought. And what's particularly interesting about this conversation is that I don't know if there's an equivalent person sort of in hydrocarbon energy for what Jim does at NERC. And so it's a real interesting role. The other thing I would say is that, his role is, we'll hear more about it as he talks about the interaction between him, the other ISOs, the PUCs, but there's a lot of moving parts here that are pretty different than oil and gas as well. So I think this will be a really interesting conversation.
Awesome. Thanks, Todd. It's a great lead in. Jim, yeah, that is branching off what Todd said. As you dig into the power world, particularly in the U.S., and you start looking at these different systems, and we have regulated and we have unregulated, and you just kind of have this this patchwork. I guess that is one of the first observations. It's a wildly complicated system, even before you get into the engineering and the money and the policy and all that stuff. Like it's born on complexity before it gets more complex. But what would you say to us?
I think you're spot on. It's the most fascinating and complex machine ever built, and and it's evolving, and it's evolving very, very rapidly, and that's what's causing a lot of challenges for us, because it's not the grid we inherited from our grandfathers, right? We're in the process of building the grid we're going to leave for our grandchildren, and it's going to look very, very different. And one of the things we've been very focused on is how to make sure that during this transition that we can keep the lights on, and utilities can. We don't actually operate the system, so I want to be clear about that, right? We kind of support the utilities and the power generators and all those people in the ecosystem that make it so that when you flip the switch, the lights come on. Because I think we all know that when you throw the switch and the lights don't come on, that's the definition of a bad day, right? And nobody wants that. So it's a fascinating responsibility that we have, and only becoming more so as time moves forward.
So Jim, it's in the title, but it is North American. So you have Canada as a part of this. There's some involvement in Mexico that you can talk to us about as well. But would you mind just describing the structure of NERC? I know that it is FERC supervises it, if you will, but maybe just explain how it fits and where the people come from and who the members are.
So we are effectively not really a membership organization, although we do refer to having members, right? We were following the 2003 blackout in the Northeast. We were given statutory authority to set and enforce reliability standards for the bulk power system. Canada very soon recognized that electricity doesn't know borders. So we operate under an MOU with each of the Canadian provinces, and that little bit of Mexico that supports San Diego in California is part of our regime as well. We're focused on what we call the bulk power system, which is the high voltage transmission system and all the power plants that support it. And our mission was defined very clearly as ensuring that the bulk power system operates reliably. And reliability was defined as avoiding cascading outages, uncontrolled separation, and instability. And that's the lens that we look through all of our issues through. What's really interesting today is that when we were formed, we were focused on basic things like vegetation management, facility ratings, basic planning, emergency operations constructs, and those things that were sort of bread and butter of the utility industry, and getting those codified in an enforceable standard. What's fascinating today is that the issues are migrating, right? Because that part of the sector is operating very, very effectively right now. And in fact, in our annual look back on the previous year's performance, we see steady improvement in things like transmission availability, misoperations rates, all those kind of core things about bulk electric system reliability. what's fascinating now is that the issues are migrating to the edges. So it's resource adequacy, it's generation interconnection, it's dealing with variability of production in with renewable resources. So it's all it's evolving and becoming more complex as time moves forward, not less.
And maybe, Jim, I'm just thinking one of the things that that people, it commonly comes up when you talk about power, at least in the U.S., is that for probably 20 plus years or for an extended period, we haven't really had growth in power demand. But now, for a number of reasons, we're experiencing growth. And as you look out a decade or two, we may experience really rapid growth, at least relative to the base. Can you familiarize us a little bit with those numbers, however you would frame them up? And because I think this is the thing that the transition gets all this discussion, but really just the demand pull that's going on in power is a really stunning thing that is maybe a bigger topic.
Oh, it's extraordinary. So the one thing people have to remember is electricity is not an energy source, right? It's a delivery mechanism. And right now, about 20% of end-use energy consumption in the United States is consumed through electricity. The rest is natural gas, heating homes, and petroleum products in your cars, and so on and so forth. So, everyone will have their own view as to how far electrification can go. But at the extreme, it could be a quintupling of the size of the industry. Now, I don't think anybody believes it'll be that big, but, I think EPRI has come out with some studies that say, look, over the next 20 to 30 years, we could double or triple the size of the electric sector to meet all the policy objectives that we're putting in place. So it's a real issue because we're struggling right now to be able to maintain what we've got with the transition from traditional generation to more what we call inverter-based generation, so wind and solar. Add on top of that the potential for rapidly increasing its size, and couple that with the fact that it's so hard to site and build any form of energy infrastructure in the country, particularly if it crosses state lines. We've got a real challenge on our hands to make this all work, given the constructs that we have. So we've been pretty clear saying we need much more policy support and policy guidance around things like infrastructure development and the like, because that's ultimately what's going to unlock the kinds of opportunities that we see in front of us.
And Jim, maybe right here while we're on this growth question, part of it, it's so interesting. You've got use of phones, just individuals' use of electricity seemingly was going up anyway. We have economic growth. You have data centers and Bitcoin, and you kind of have these non-policy driven just sort of growth and usage trends. Then you add on policy demands or focus items, and then you layer in the constraints. But there's a fair amount of the growth that is just happening as a result of economic growth and the way the country is changing its habits before you even get into policy. I mean, is that?
Absolutely. The rise in AI, for example, is a particularly strong driver. I think these numbers aren't going to be precisely correct, but the amount of energy that results from a chat GPT search versus a typical internet search is multiples because of the data center intensity that triggers. That triggers air conditioning load in the data centers, as well as just kind of the number that we need to have to do all this stuff. So you're right. Without policy direction around transportation and space heating, just because of the rise of technology and the different ways we're using technology right now, we're seeing significant growth and concentrated in certain jurisdictions. Data centers, crypto mining, all those things create real need for better planning and integration of our system. And we haven't even gotten into weather yet. So let's hold that up for a second conversation, because that's a really important driver too.
Well, it just gets to your point about, you said up front, remember, electricity is just a means of delivering energy. It's not an energy source. But in the common vernacular, no one says, well, we need to decarbonize, so put your phone down. Like no one thinks like that. But I mean, this power use thing is really amazing.
Yeah, it is extraordinary, particularly just given the way technology has infiltrated every aspect of our lives. And most people kind of have this sense that power comes from the wall, right? But it doesn't, right? There's a lot of infrastructure behind that, making those outlets work. So there's a real challenge here coming our way.
You mentioned we talked about the patchwork and the way in which this whole system has come together, and that's just where we are. And then you talk about trying to do some systemic things, and one of those we always talk about, transmission. If it was a national grid, would it be easier to fix? This is a completely rhetorical question, but if it was a national grid, would it be easier to fix the transmission problems, or how much of a problem is it that we have this patchwork just in and of itself? Does that prevent us from really doing the things that need to be done?
I don't know if it's the structure of the transmission system that is the issue nearly as much as it is the processes we have in place to develop new infrastructure. I mean, there's no doubt that the way the industry is structured, right, creates challenges for us, right? And we discovered that originally in 1965 when a relay outside of Toronto blacked out New York City, and then in 2003 when a tree contacted a line in Ohio knocked out the whole Northeast. So the needs for coordination are incredibly high in this system, but we figured out how to do that, for the most part, and that's kind of one of the reasons why we were formed, was to drive all those standards that govern the way the utilities interact with each other. We are right now in the process of doing an assessment, was mandated by Congress in the debt ceiling bill last summer, looking at interregional transfer capacity. And I need to kind of wait and let that work kind of conclude, which it will over the course of the next 10 or 11 months. But transmission is going to be very important. One, to share resources across control areas, and particularly the thing that's unique about clean energy, like wind and solar, you can't move the fuel, right? You got to produce it where the fuel is, right? So that's going to drive more and more need for interstate transmission if we want to meet any of these goals that we have set for ourselves. And interstate transmission's hard. There was a project in the desert Southwest that I think has now started construction, called the Sunzia project. Development on that started in 2006, and it just received its final construction permit this summer. So that's 17 years, and that's a two-state line, right? If you kind of fast forward to think about multi-state lines and kind of how we're going to get power out of the Southwest to Chicago, and from the Dakotas to Houston and all that kind of stuff, you start to see we got a real siting and permitting challenge in front of us. And that's why it's getting so much attention in Congress, although I don't think we've come close to cracking the code on how we're going to get it done.
Hey, Jim, I was really interested in, we look at the quarterly reports for all these utilities and infrastructure companies, and what struck me, this quarter is one of the biggest infrastructure companies out there. I'm not going to name who it is, but they bought themselves a transformer company, one of the biggest transformer companies here in the U.S. And the reason wasn't all about we can make a lot of money here. It was more of we need to have this company because we're putting these projects together, and we need to have the supply chain. We need to know that it's going to be there so we can do it on time, on budget, stuff of that nature. How do you see the supply lines and the whole energy transition right now? Is it a concern right now? How are things going to change in the future?
So supply chain is a huge issue, and it hits this industry in multiple ways. When we pursued kind of globalization and in pursuit of cost reductions and so forth, a lot of U.S. manufactured goods moved overseas, and not all of them to countries that are particularly friendly to us. And so there are two issues here. One is actually just getting the goods when you need them. It's a huge issue for transformers. But the other issue is you got to bring in the security question, particularly things that are coming from that are software based or are coming from countries that I said aren't necessarily have the same interests as we do in terms of national security. So I think the notion of repatriating a lot of manufacturing is pretty right-minded from a national security perspective. And then the demands for equipment, whether it's distribution transformers, large-scale transmission-level transformers, relays, all of those devices that are important for making the grid operate. Right now, we don't make much of that stuff in this country. We make some of it, but I think that's going to be a theme over the next, 5 to 20 years, and it may never not be a theme, given the growth demands we just described for the country.
Yeah, what's also interesting to me is, all the focus always tends to be on the coal closures or just the renewable growth. No one really wants to talk about the backbone, which is a transmission. How many people in DC are talking about that? All those renewable things, those sound sexy and everything, but just the transmission seems to be the one thing it's lagging. Is that a concern for you? What can we do on a national level to really kind of accelerate more permitting, stuff of that nature?
Well, I think transmission is very well appreciated for its importance, and I think all the issues around supply chain are also well appreciated for their importance for making all this work. I think the challenge is that it's very, very hard for the federal government, given the authorities that they have, to crack the code on these issues. So while it's a topic of a lot of conversation, I think it takes a lot of distributed initiative in order to make these things work. And permitting is very challenging because, appropriately, local communities, ought to have a say in what infrastructure gets built within their area. But the concept of not in my backyard hasn't really shifted to yes in my backyard yet. And that's going to be one of the issues and challenges we have, is how to drive a stronger view of a collective future, recognizing that communities are going to be impacted because, let's face it, energy infrastructure isn't always the most attractive thing to look at, and they do create the sector does create real environmental impact, whether it's air emissions, water emissions, or just land use issues around renewables. So it's not an easy problem to solve.
Jim, can I just ask you? We hear a lot about transformers in particular. Is that like the top of the list? Wow, we got to start making these in the U.S. Type product?
Distribution transformers are a real issue. One, because they're almost a consumable, right? Utilities are constantly replacing transformers, whether it's in response to storm-based restoration in the South with hurricanes, or just growth, and transformers get damaged, particularly distribution transformers, car accidents on utility poles, people taking shots at them for sport, that kind of stuff. And the supply chain for them is not particularly robust. Plus, there are some rules coming out on transformer efficiency using more exotic material that will drive the use of more exotic materials in them. And everyone's scratching their head on how that's going to help bolster stores of those devices. The other issue that the industry is getting its head around is most transformers are custom designed for a particular utility spec, and the utility industry didn't start out with let's design a standard and all use the same design, right, in terms of where the wires come in and where cooling material and so on and so forth is added. So that's another real opportunity that the sector is trying to get its head around, is standardizing designs on this kind of equipment.
Hey, Jim, you talked a minute ago about the statutory mandate that you guys have on reliability, but talk to the audience about the interaction between sort of the ISOs and market designers and then the state PUCs. because if you're in charge of reliability, what those other organizations are doing are going to have a big impact on that. So how does that work? What does the feedback look like? What are those interactions that take place between you and some of these other bodies that are focused on power?
Yeah, so let me answer that a couple different ways. So for those entities that are actively engaged in the operation of the grid, we oversee them. So the RTOs, the ISOs, the utilities themselves, the power generators are all subject to a suite of standards that we put in place, monitor compliance with, and then enforce non-compliance. Now we work very collaboratively with industry. We have a very unique model in terms of making sure that the work that we're doing is appropriately informed by the realities of kind of boots on the ground experience that the RTOs or the ISOs would have. But they're subject to our standards, so we're technically a regulator of them. With respect to the state PUCs, right, they're kind of outside of our jurisdiction. So our focus with them is to collaborate, inform, right, and find ways where we can, incent them to take decisions where they are making decisions that will have bulk power system reliability impacts. One of the biggest issues that we're working on right now is related to we call them inverter-based resources, but think of them as solar. That's coming on not at the bulk electric system level that we think about it, but more on the distribution system. Well, those resources, because of the way they behave, have real implications for bulk electric reliability. So we're in the process right now of figuring out how to register them and then think through an appropriate set of requirements for them, even though they're not technically under our formal jurisdiction, but we can reach in and make sure that they're doing the right things for reliability. But we do that on a consensual basis for the most part.
Is there anything we can learn? And I just, as you were talking, I thought of like in Europe, you've got the Germans retiring nukes, you've got the French with more nukes. They've got this sort of mishmash of authorities and regulatory bodies. I don't know if it's similar to us or not. They're also seem to be a little ahead of us in terms of deploying more intermittent resources. I mean, do we look at them and say, here's what to do, or maybe what not to do? Are there any learnings we can take from that?
There are learnings all over the globe because there are places that are ahead of and behind in certain areas, and we're trying to really make sure that our work is informed by global experience, not just our experience in the U.S. So, for example, one of the big issues we're faced with right now is how to think about resource adequacy in a system that is energy constrained, not capacity constrained. And it turns out that Australia may actually be the best role model, or at least the furthest ahead in thinking through how to set a standard for energy availability, and then design to that, use that as the design basis as opposed to our 1 in 10 year capacity standard. Europe has a lot more experience, particularly with wind, and we're working to draw on their experiences as we think about the integration of extraordinary amounts of wind onto the system. Getting into the German and French policies around nuclear and coal and so forth, that's more of a resource selection issue, and I think really more one that's really reserved to the states in their resource planning efforts.
Jim, I was wondering when Todd asked his question there, when you talk about the standards that you have, and in that sense, there's a little bit of a regulatory component. Do you mind talking about exactly what those standards are? Because as I've understood it, it's not that you're saying they're very specific. I mean, people still get to choose their energy systems, but then you have certain standards around various components of it. But would you just maybe try to explain standards and what that really means?
Yeah, so we do not have authority to order anybody to build anything or do anything in the construction side. Those issues are all reserved to the states, and that's codified in legislation. What our standards do is really govern the performance of the system, right? And so they're really performance-based standards for the most part. And and utilities have to adhere to them. We deal with how the grid is planned, operated, how they operate during an emergency situation, what sort of requirements they need to maintain as it relates to stability, frequency, those kinds of issues. And our standards are also the way we describe them. This is particularly true in the security space because we also do cybersecurity and physical security standards and requirements. They're really meant to be kind of a baseline, right? And the way I think about them, and this analogy helps some people, is I think about them as as being similar to the CCRs in your homeowners association or your condo building, right? They're there to kind of make the neighborhood safe and preserve the value of your investment in real estate. Same thing with the electric system, right? I could be the best run utility on the planet, but if those neighboring systems around me aren't doing what they need to do, that'll compromise my performance to my customers. So I always tell people the standards are never about you, they're about your neighbor, right? Because you want to make sure that your neighbor doesn't paint his house purple and let weeds grow in his yard and all that kind of stuff. And so that's what we try to do with the standards, is to make sure that we set a baseline level of performance that everybody has to meet. And if they do, that the grid will operate reliably. Now, that doesn't preclude people from doing more. And in fact, particularly in the security space, we're very mindful that the standards really are just a baseline level of protection. And there's much more that needs to go into the soup to create a cyber and physically secure grid.
So do you ever, it's fascinating, you get to see, behind the scenes, you see all these systems and all these decisions and then all the performance data. So you really, you've got an independent look into all of these things. And some of these systems just work better than others, right? Like some places are having more problems than others. Some places seem to have more cost than others. Like, I'm sure, do you ever get pushed to say like, Jim, can you please rate all the power systems in the United States and tell us who has the best stuff? And I'm sure you have to say, no, I'm not doing that. But you could do that, right? You do know all this stuff.
Yeah, we could, but it wouldn't be helpful. It wouldn't be helpful in the way people want to use it.
You could have the reliability Oscars and say the nominees are, and then maybe just good examples or something.
Well, no, there you go. No, the challenge with this sector, and this is why our collaborative model works, I think, so well, is that the issues that the utilities face are so different as you move around the continent that it's really not fair to compare a utility operating in the Southwest with a utility operating in the Southeast. Very, very different climatic conditions, versus a utility in the Midwest. The issues are just so different as you move around the country. And so that's one of the challenges we have when we develop our standards, because they're enforceable nationwide, right? So we always make sure that they are sensitive and can accommodate local regional differences where appropriate. We also have a series of 6 regional entities that they're actually independent companies, but they operate under a delegation agreement from us. And they have the authority, and some of them do in certain areas, where they can pass either their own standards or their own criteria for how a NERC standard would express itself in the West, for example. And that's a very important tool that we have to make sure that we stay relevant across the entire footprint of the continent.
And are you getting, Jim, in your role, exposure to, new battery technologies or, things like how are we going to scale certain technologies, whatever it is? Like, how much do you come in contact with the way in which things are changing at the margin from a technology standpoint?
Increasing, I'll put it that way, right? One of the things that we learned was that we learned this over the last 5 or 6 years, right? When you had 5-10% solar on your system, didn't make that big of a difference, right? Because they were built to follow the rest of the system. And when you had natural gas disruptions 10 years ago, wasn't that big of a deal because you had a lot of coal around and nuclear that could kind of fill that gap. What we're basically finding now is that the water's going out, right? And so we're finding all of these issues that were actually there, 5 years, 10 years ago. But because we don't have the depth in the system that we had then, issues are starting to expose themselves. So we're seeing places now where solar's 20, 30, 40% of the resource mix. And when it's that big, they can't follow anymore. They got to start to lead. And that's where you get into a topic that we're turning our attention now is the requirements around what we call grid forming inverters. So inverters that will actually kind of form frequency and form voltage, as opposed to just follow what the big spinning plants create. The role of natural gas right now is very, very different than it was 10 years ago, right? Mm-hmm. Because it's now the core fuel. It's the fuel that keeps the lights on. And so when we have these big winter storm events like we had in Uri or with Elliott last year, the performance of the natural gas system is probably the single biggest driver of power interruptions during these cold weather events. And of course, the performance of the electric system is really important to the performance of the gas system, right? Because of the compressor stations and so on and so forth. So these systems are so intertwined right now. We really got to start thinking of them as a single system, right? As opposed to the way the gas industry historically has thought of itself as a vehicle for delivering molecules to whoever will buy them at the highest price. And the power guys would think about their fuel mix as what's my cheapest fuel to buy right now, given my suite of generating plants. We've taken a lot of that flexibility away. And so we really need to start thinking about particularly gas and electric as one harmonized system that needs to operate in sync, particularly during these very cold weather events. And that's proving to be quite challenging, as you can see from our winter storm assessments.
One thing I think simplistically, when you look at what we're doing to our electricity system, is one of the mistakes, like, I don't think people quibble, this is my impression, I don't think people quibble with, let's do some more stuff, let's get some more batteries, let's find better ways to use solar and wind, let's do all that stuff. But where we get in trouble is when we start saying, let's shut down these coal plants, don't build another natural gas. Even a few years ago, we were shutting nuclear plants. At least we've kind of stopped doing that. But it seems like it's in the second part of the equation where we're really making some poor choices. Because the first part is not terribly controversial, but shutting stuff that works, that seems like that's where the debate should be happening.
You're spot on, Maynard. From our perspective, bring on the wind, bring on the solar, bring on the batteries as fast as you can, right? No issues or concerns with that. The issue is that when you shut down a coal plant or a nuclear plant or a natural gas plant, you not only lose the energy that they provide, you also lose what we call essential reliability services. So the way you've always traditionally made electricity is you boil water, you make something spin that's got a magnet on it, and you get current, right? And we've learned how to control that within very tight frequencies, very tight bands around frequency and voltage. With these new resources, whether it's wind, solar, batteries, they're interconnecting to the grid through power electronics, through a software device. And it doesn't naturally create those same services. So we need to be much more prescriptive around how those devices operate and making sure that they're contributing to the reliability of the grid and not. And the importance of dispatchability, which is the other magic thing you get with natural gas plants, is that until we have something else that's dispatchable, right, we're going to be challenged, right, to fill the peaks and valleys of variable energy production. So our concern has always been the rate at which we're losing those reliability services and dispatchability, much more so than the rate at which we're adding new forms of generation onto the grid, because that former part is so critical. to keeping the grid operating stably.
Well, I'm having a flashback, guys, too. We had Meredith Engwin on, and she wrote Shorting the Grid, which was a discussion of PUC decision making. But I feel like what we learned is what people don't really appreciate it. And Jim, let me try this language on you and see if it works. It's not just that wind and solar are intermittent and you don't know when they're throwing power into the mix. It's that when they produce power, they're not producing the same kind of power that's just easily roped into the system. You have to manage how you carefully dial that power in. This was your comment on the frequency and how we've learned to make power over the years.
Yeah, that's spot on. And there are two or three issues with renewables, and I'll use solar as an example, or wind. You pick whichever one you want. One is, do they integrate with the grid in a way that promotes reliability? That's the inverter issue, right? That's making sure that the power electronics are programmed and incented to respond to things on the grid in a way that promotes reliability as opposed to detract from them. Then we've written, gobs of studies on inverter-based failures. The most dramatic one was Odessa, Texas in August last year, where a simple ground to current fault on the system, modest disturbance would have cleared itself with no problem. The inverters in West Texas saw it, panicked, they all tripped off the grid. We lost 1,700 megawatts of generation on that, within a very short period of time. That created another frequency event, so we lost 800 megawatts of conventional generation. So for something that would have cleared itself pretty easily, we lost 2.5 gigawatts of generation, 2.5 nuclear plants, right? That's got to stop, right? So that's the grid, the inverter integration problem. The second is the variability problem. Right. And that we can plan around, right? As long as we have other flexible resources or maybe flexible demand, right? Like crypto mining and stuff like that, right? We can learn to balance that and deal with the peaks and troughs of variability. And then the last is when you get these widespread events. So great statistic. I think the numbers are roughly 60 gigawatts of wind across the backbone of the continent. On June 6th of this year, 200 megawatts showed up. I mean, the wind wasn't blowing anywhere, right? And that can happen, right? But you got to plan for that. You got to have other resources to be able to deal with that. I flew into Amsterdam on Labor Day. They had a similar event there, right? Where none of the turbines out in the North Sea were spinning because it was just stagnant. So we got to recognize that, when you're moving toward more weather-dependent fuels, right, we have to have the humility to understand that we can't predict the weather as reliably as we would like to believe we can, and other things need to fill that void when it occurs.
Boy, that was a stunning statistic. I was imagining if we said about natural gas plants, two-thirds of the time you will not have fuel. Somebody would say, well, I don't want to build that. It's just really, it's fascinating to think about that kind of variability.
Yeah, and, you always also have the issue of the duration of the droughts, right? So, what if it's not windy for a week, right? That happens. Or, if you're in the upper Midwest, you get cloud cover that persists my friends in Minnesota tell me it persists for 3 months. I don't know if that's true or not, but those are the realities of the system. And that's where storage and other forms of energy storage become so important. Now, I don't think anybody believes we're going to create a battery that's going to last 3 months, right? But right now, the best battery technology we have is a 4-hour lithium-ion battery. Has made tremendous differences in places like California and in Texas that's kind of dealing with variability and solar ramps and all that kind of stuff. So I don't want to be perceived here as being against them, because they're awesome, right? And they're making great inroads and making great contributions to the reliability of the grid. But 4 hours isn't enough, right? We need days, and that brings you into things like physical forms of storage, pump storage, very, very difficult to permit. So I think that's where the next kind of real breakthrough is going to be is going to be in some sort of long duration storage technology that can be built at the scale that we need it to. That's the other issue people don't get, is that this is an enormously large industry, right? We talk about 2 to 3 gigawatts of batteries and congratulate ourselves, because that's an amazing achievement, right? We may eventually need to have half a terawatt of capacity on the system. That's a lot.
Yeah, I'm curious, Jim. Do you guys at NERC put out a sort of a 3 or 5 year sort of a S&D outlook on a yearly basis?
So we don't do proprietary forecasts. What we do is we aggregate what we get from all the utility systems around the continent, and we produce 3. We do an upcoming summer seasonal assessment. We do a winter assessment. Our winter assessment for this year is going to be published this week, and then every year we do a 10-year outlook. And you probably have seen them, because we started to produce these very simple maps that kind of show areas that are at heightened risk of having energy shortfalls, particularly under extreme weather conditions. And what's been very disturbing to see is that every year we produce them, more and more parts of the country are at heightened risk, which is a paradox given how well the grid is performing. But it's because of this resource changeover, and then the changing weather conditions that the industry has to support is what's driving this outlook.
Yeah, and the reason I asked that is maybe more from a, what do you expect those reports to look like in the next 6, 9, 12 months? And we talked about in the lead-in that some of the growth in some of these regional areas from just these data centers is going up multiples. And so it seems to me that the next report we get and the next report we get after that is just going to show us that demand is growing significantly higher than it has over the last 10 years by a factor of maybe 10 or 15 to 1, to be honest with you. Maybe I'm being a little crazy there, but it obviously flows into just reliability. I mean, how quickly are we going to have reliability issues? Is it going to be 2 years out, or is it going to be 2 or 3 months out? Any thoughts there on just, I mean, how do you think these reports are going to look at over the next say several quarters from a demand standpoint? Because over the last 10 years, demand's been like this. Now it looks like it's going like that.
Yeah, we really haven't added much demand to the grid over the last 10, 20 years, right? Because we've been, focused on energy efficiency. We've been turning over appliances and stuff like that to more efficient models and so forth. So this really is an unprecedented period of time. And, whether it's the data centers that we talked about, if it's some of these policies around space heating and natural gas and converting that to heat pumps, or if it's just a lot of people think we're right now poised to where electric transportation could really take off, right? Those are enormous sources of energy demand. And if those get converted, through policy or just through natural economic forces to electricity, we're going to see enormous growth in demand. We're starting to see that in our long-term assessment now. Where again, we really never saw much growth, but in fact, I was just looking at a chart, and this latest one that we've done, we're seeing capacity on average decline by 3% and growth increase by 4%. So that's a 7% deficit right there, right? So all the largesse that we've benefited from over the last 20 years, because we had a very rich, diverse resource base, kind of going away, and we're much closer to the margin than we've been before. So to answer your question, absent some change in the trajectory that we're on, we will continue to see elevated risk for outages under increasingly less extreme conditions, because the system's losing its slack.
Hey, Jim, last question from me, and you touched on this in your last answer. You talked a lot about bulk electricity grid, but kind of on the distributed level, small scale, that's changing a lot too. As EVs are coming in, people are charging them. They have, more power, storage resources sometimes at home. You've got distributed solar. That's a big deal. How do you think about that, and how is that helping or hurting, the rest of what's going on? We tend to focus on these big utility scale intermittent resources, but we're seeing really small scale resources change a lot as well.
Yeah, it's wouldn't describe it as good or bad. I would just describe it as different. And so the challenges that are created there is if you're a bulk system operator, like a PJM or a MISO or one of the big RTOs or even a large utility, as we add more and more stuff onto the distribution system, you don't see it, right? Because it's kind of thought of as a deduction from load as opposed to a source of demand. And so if you think about the way I characterize this tritely is if you're a system operator now, you really don't know what generation is going to show up because you got more and more wind and solar. So at any point in time, you don't really know what's going to be there. And you don't really know what demand is anymore because it's masked because of, rooftop solar, distributed generation, and so forth. Other than that, it's a pretty good job. But it's a real challenge to have visibility. And so one of the things we've been focusing on is making sure that there's good information flow back and forth so that the grid operators who are ultimately responsible for the reliability of the system have as much information as they need to be able to make the kinds of decisions that they do. Now, I think these devices are terrific, right? And if you look at the big difference between August 2020, when there was a heat wave in California, and I think for at least one, maybe two nights, Cal ISO had to rotate outages to nearly 1 million customers. Compare that event to the last Labor Day, September event, right, where there were no outages, right? The biggest difference in the system was the presence of batteries, and the quote unquote the virtual power plants and the increasing amount of solar that's been added to the system there. So these resources are great. They make a real difference in the reliability and the operability of the grid, but they bring with them some challenges to manage through. And that's the way I think about all these issues. Nothing's good or bad. Everything involves trade-offs. And we just have to make sure that our tools and our protocols are matching the physical realities of the devices on the grid.
I guess, Jim, building on Todd's question, so individuals are increasingly, doing things at their home, taking steps to get their own power needs taken care of. And I saw it in some of your speeches. You talk about decentralization and companies doing the same thing. And we XYZ industrial company, we're going to have our own power plant or our own solar or our own system. That's an interesting trend. I'm sure you would echo some of the comments you already made about individuals doing it as companies doing it. If this trend continues, I know you said it's not a good thing or a bad thing, but is it really a neutral thing if it continues? It seems like it's ultimately, it could be negative because it's so fragmenting what we're seemingly trying to do with our power systems.
Well, it's a great question, and I'm not a futurist, but let's assume that all these.
But Jim, the light is changing there in your room. You're starting to look like a futurist right now.
I should have flames shooting up behind me. It'd be like the
no, it's very good. We need a crystal ball. Get the crystal ball immediately. Anyway.
Yeah. No, there's no doubt that the system will change, and let's assume that we continue to add on the kinds of distributed resources that we're seeing now, either at the residential level or at the commercial level and industrial level, as you mentioned. I think there'll always be some role for the interconnected system to balance that. So the role of the bulk power system might change over time, and that'll probably require new tools and new protocols and new ways of thinking and so forth. But it's very hard for me to believe that people are going to go off the grid, and the companies are going to go off the grid. The risk is too high, and the grid is amazing in its ability to do what it does. But I think it'll change, and this is kind of the issue the natural gas industry is facing right now with its role with power. Gas is essential, but we're probably over time going to be consuming less molecules as fuel because we're going to be consuming wind and solar and the like. But we're going to need all that infrastructure and probably more storage, more flexibility, and all those great things that we get out of the natural gas system. it's torturing the way we think about the relationship between the two sectors. And the bulk power system will look the same way with respect to changes on the distribution system. It'll change and require new ways of thinking and new tools, but I think it's always going to be an essential part of our electricity supply.
Well, I guess one way to think about all these ways in which the system is changing here as we wrap up, as we think about the next 10 years in power, because of all these trends we've talked about today, we're always instinctively drawn to the conclusion that power is going to be probably more expensive and probably less reliable, generally speaking, over the next 10 years. And that's also based on currently what we're talking about doing and pursuing. Does that seem like a reasonable conclusion to you, or is that negative?
Well, I will tell you, I'm going to do everything in my power to make sure that it doesn't lose reliability. Right?
Well, there's no reflection on you. It would have been much worse without you, but.
No. This is our job, right? Is to make sure that as this grid transforms, it maintains the level of reliability that we count on. And like I said, that number, our tolerance for even momentary outages is going to continue to decline as more and more stuff becomes electrified. So that's our mission, and that's what we live for every day. I do think it's going to become more expensive, at least for a while. Now, maybe eventually, right, when you got all the capital in place and so on and so forth, the fact that we have a lot of zero or negative marginal cost generation on the system will start to produce some consumer benefit. But I think right now, the amount of capital that's likely to be needed to support the transition, whether it's in transmission or new generation resources, wind, solar, what have you, that's a lot of capital, right? And given the interest rate environment that we're in and are likely to be in for a while, I don't see it being very cheap anytime real soon.
Jim, thank you for everything you're doing to try to make all this better, and thank you for spending an hour with us. It's really fantastic. We'll come see you. Please come see us in Houston.
Well, next time I'll make sure that the lighting's a little bit better. But I kind of like this look, right? It's kind of the now if I only had one of those hats with the horns like Fred Flintstone used to wear, then I'd really feel good about it.
It's kind of like you're in a ski lodge or something, and you're just looking at the fire. So it's a great look. Well, Jim, thanks for joining us. We really appreciate it. Thanks, everybody.